of the things that we would appreciate having is some resources and sort of ideas on how to provide ministry and be in ministry, particularly with youth and young adults who are neurodiverse or on the autism spectrum. There are different needs, also different gifts that those kids can offer to our ministry and as part of our communities. And I'm fortunate because I've known Erin for way more years than I can count. And she immediately came to mind as like, she'd be perfect to talk to us about working with neurodiverse kids. Erin's a special ed teacher at Centennial High School now in Saskatoon. And I could speak about Erin forever, but I'm not going to. Erin is wonderful.
Yeah, just like Ken said, I've been a special ed teacher now for 26 years, and I've taught pretty much my whole career in special ed. So I've taught everything from a special needs program, the functional life skills program that some of the high schools have. So I've been immersed with kids who are very low functioning, and I'm now working with high school kids. And so the needs are diverse here as well. So I have some experience, and hopefully I can help share that and give you some insight. I did a PowerPoint and I set it up thinking, if you're working with youth, what's the most useful information you would want, and probably just ways to work with them or strategies that could help you. Now, in that sense, I don't know if you'd be having them in a group for activities or if you'd be, leading them in ministry, but just things that might help understand how to, if there's behaviors or triggers, how to help them be part of a group, because socialization is really difficult for these type of kids. So yeah, on this, but a little bit of background. What is autism spectrum disorder? Well, obviously it's a neurological disorder, and it's the main impact of communication and social and emotional development. There's no defining physical features, but they do communicate differently. They interact differently. They learn differently. And that's the biggest part of what their disorder is. They have deficits and excesses. Deficits in language. You can have an autistic or an Asperger who might be nonverbal, completely nonverbal, some who have minimal language, and then some that have perfect language, that speak. Social skills are impacted. Their perceptions are impacted. They don't always read social cues. They don't know how to behave in some social settings. Executive functions and motor skills. And then with excesses, they might be non-compliant, but also adhere to routines. Lots of them have to have a specific routine. And can't those little arrows disappeared again? Did you do something before to share? There they are. Okay. Takes a minute here to switch. So there you go. ASD, like we talked about, is characterized by deficits in social communication and social interactions, and restrictive repetitive behaviors, interests, and activities. And when we talk about those social communication and social interactions, I'll give some examples of that later, but I like not understanding sarcasm, not getting humor with that social communication, looking very aloof when you talk to them. They might not make any facial expressions. Restrictive repetitive behaviors, rocking, some of the more severe ones are the rocking behaviors. Like Sheldon on Big Bang Theory has got the knocking of the door, that's a characteristic. So those repetitive behaviors. And they get focused on certain interests and activities. I've had students that have been obsessed with sports teams, but not to the point where they can recite every playoff game and everything they've ever known about that team. So then they have those deep interests that can kind of sometimes get them caught up on sometimes. So the deficits in social communication, like I've mentioned, impact how they communicate effectively. They have a hard time starting a conversation and keeping a conversation, and may not know how to express those needs. And we'll talk about how we can deal with that. They often don't make eye contact sometimes, and they have difficulty establishing those relationships. Students I work with right now don't have a peer group, and it's kind of disappointing they don't have a peer group, but they want it. So we work a lot about how do you talk to people appropriately? How do you start a conversation? So those are some things my high school students we have to work on. Reading the feelings. I was trying to joke with my girl today and she doesn't get my humor. She just looks at me because she doesn't understand it, and I have to accept that. That's just, she doesn't understand it. Like avoid eye contact. When I'm talking to my one student, he looks over my shoulder. He doesn't make eye contact. And that make them look like they're unaware that you're talking to them. So sometimes you have to work on getting their attention to know that they are listening. And then repeating. My student today, when she doesn't have anything to say, how are you today? How are you today? And she says that intermittently throughout class. That's what she repeats. That's her choice of phrase. So we talked about those restrictive repetitive behaviors, and that means they might have trouble expressing their needs and getting past that repetitive behavior. Again, I'll use my example today because I had her this morning. She needed help, but she had a hard time getting past, like she was picking her fingers because that's one of her repetitive behaviors. And I knew she wanted help, but she wasn't sure how to ask for it. And so I finally said to her, do you need help? And she said, yes. So sometimes those repetitive behaviors can get in the way of things. And like we talked about, having trouble adapting to routine. When I taught in the functional life skills program, we used lots of visuals, and those are things I'm going to tell you about as a strategy. Knowing what their routine is. So if you're doing a planned activity and you're switching to another activity, you might have an individual who needs to know when that's happening or when is it going to happen. You can't just bring it upon them. They have to know what's happening. Fire drills are big for these kids in our school. They have to know when the fire drill is because it's not a good adjustment for them. They get interested in certain things. I have a student that all she ate was mac and cheese. That was her favorite food. So they have an interest in food or objects. And like I said, baseball team, my one student, he fixated with the Blue Jays, and that's one kind of activity he likes to talk about. Now the sensory inputs are a big one. Again, I'm living in the world with 3 of them right now. One of them can't stand it when I chew gum. That is super sensitive to her. So if I'm in the classroom and she's across the room, she can hear me chewing gum. And she gets very upset and tells me, stop chewing your gum. I have a student that certain clothing bothers him, so he wears compression shirts underneath because that seems to help with that clothing sensitivity. And then, like I said, certain sounds, sometimes smells or textures, this all falls under that umbrella of what their hypo or hyperactivity sensory inputs that bother them. And then again, we talked about engaging in actions repeatedly. I've got a girl that picks her fingers. I had a student that would rock when they got upset. But this is a wide variety. It can be extreme and it can be very little, depending on their disorder. Oftentimes it's talked about as the sixth sense. We have that social sense. We innately know when someone's upset. We innately know when someone's mad. We read facial expressions. They can't read facial expressions. They don't know what other people are thinking all the time. And we are able to do that. So that's why sometimes it's referred to as a sixth sense impairment, because they can't pick up on those social cues and what other people are thinking or what other people are feeling. So how do you support them? Well, one thing I like to tell people is ask the caregivers, ask the guardians, ask the parents. Do they have triggers? Do they have sensitivities? You know, what are the repetitive behaviors? And that's a good place to start to know what strategies work. But there are a few tips that I like to use, and you'll see there at the bottom. We're going to talk about using positive opposites, established attending, effective instructions, visual supports, and then breaking the skill down. I know I'm going really fast, but I think it's just because I'm a little bit nervous. Sorry. So what's a positive opposite? Well, that's when you don't use the negative to give the direction, because that might set them off. So instead of saying, don't run around, you want to just say, we walk, please. And there's some examples. Don't yell inside. Use a quiet, gentle voice. And instead of saying, what are you doing? Say, tell me what you're doing. So that's one technique, using that positive reinforcement to change the behavior if the behavior isn't what you want. Establish attending. So this is when you want to know that they're getting the instructions, they're listening to you. They might, like I said, I have a student that looks over my shoulder. So I want him to look at me when I'm giving his instructions. So they might focus on something else like eyebrow movements instead of the words you're saying. So you want to get their attention, reduce all distractions, and give the instructions as soon as possible. So if you've got a group of kids and you know you have a kid with ASD, you want to make sure that they're not distracted, they're looking at you and they're understanding your instructions. And you might have to use a physical prompt, to get their attention. You might have a hand signal or hold something up, depending on the disorder. Instructions are important because you can't give vague instructions. You have to be very specific. And it could be a nonverbal cue, or it could just be one simple instruction. So when you give the instructions, don't phrase it as a question. Don't say, okay, we're going to get in the car now, right? You just say, get in the car. You don't want to phrase it as a question. You want to use as little words as possible, depending, like again, on the need. And if they're looking at you confused or with a blank stare, reword it, and maybe you need to use a visual. And like I said, again, depending on what the disorder is, of how severe it is. And then ask them, oftentimes I ask any student to repeat this, but even those kids, I'll say, what did I say? Tell me back what we're doing now. So get them to repeat it. Visual supports. I love using visual supports because it's such a good way to communicate with them, especially if you've got nonverbal kids or kids who can't take a lot of instruction, and you give them a photo, and it helps communicate your expectations through a visual. They can communicate needs. I have used lots of visuals with my special needs program where we had a chart with Velcro. It's old school, but they would stick the photos on and they could tell me what they were asking for, what they needed. And it also, with that routine, they know what to expect next and what's going to happen. So here's like a first then board that I used often. First we wash our hands, then we eat lunch. And it's just an easy visual. And you can use this in any way, an iPad, you can use it with Velcro and different stickers or pictures you could put on there. But all I had to do was show the first then board, and my nonverbal girl understood what she had to do. So I'm a big proponent of visuals, and you can use it as a routine or a schedule. So if you've got an activity planned for a couple hours, this is what we're doing first. They can see they're going to do a game, then they're going to have a snack, going for a walk, and then they're going home. Now, this is a bit elementary, and if you've got older adults, you could adjust it. Like I do for high school kids. I don't use visuals because I don't have kids right now in high school that need the visuals, but I do have to make sure that instructions are simple and that they know what's happening next. And sometimes I just make a list on a whiteboard for them. And like I said, visuals break it down. They can depict what steps they're supposed to do in the expectation. And it promotes a bit of independence, especially if you've got a large group. They can go look at whatever visuals or whatever you've written down, and they can see a schedule, or they can see what's happening next without having to ask you all the time or having you tell them all the time. And then reminding them as well. This is just Temple Grandin. I'm sure you've heard of her. She's an amazing woman. She has autism. She's written a lot of resources. And this is just a couple of readings if you wanted to go a little further into the autistic world and the Asperger's spectrum, or the spectrum disorders. And, they're just some interesting readings. And that's it for me. And can't have this. So if you were trying to frantically take notes, which I'm sure you all were, copy of this.
We've got lots, yeah, we'll have lots of resources and things. Thanks, Erin. That's really helpful to sort of lay out some of those tips and tricks things. Can we ask you all sorts of, like, you're good at telling stories. Are there stories and things that you want to share before we dive into asking you questions? Like,
like I said, I've got 3 students right now that all fall under this umbrella, and they all are very different. And I deal with each one of them differently because they have different triggers and different sensitivities. And one is very aloof. Like I said before, he looks over my shoulder when I talk to him, and you don't know if he's there listening to you. And another boy won't engage unless you engage with him. He doesn't initiate conversation. And then I have one that talks, but she's repetitive in her talking. She talks about the same thing. 90 Day Fiancé.
Yeah.
That's her thing. So.
I'm sure it'll come up, but maybe I'll just sort of preempt some of the conversation a bit. Like, how do you manage kids who may be neurodiverse or on the autism spectrum in other contexts with kids who aren't don't have the same sort of needs, like sort of kids who are, I don't know what the phrase is for not neurodiverse. How do you manage that?
Well, what I've done, and it depends on the setting and the group, I have students that are very aware of the needs of these other students. And we've talked about how we can support them, because some students are really wanting to be supportive and helpful. Other students, I tell them, you know, that's that student's behavior. You can choose to just, you know, don't engage if you don't want to, just be tolerant. But if you want to, this is how you can help them. This is how you can support them. So I guess it depends on the group you're with and how willing they want, the willingness, but always educate your other your other individuals about that person, because the more they know, the easier it's going to be for everybody. And then they can also help you. If you can't be the eyes and ears all the time, you have other people to support you. If you think that student is upset by something, or there's a change in sudden routine and it triggered something in that student, and you have another individual to say, hey, I think we need to support this kid, you know, in that sense. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, sorry, I'm going on here, but I think that's one of the challenges, is both figuring out how to interact with the individual, but also helping the community learn more too, like both the other kids, but the entire church congregation too, because, you know, sometimes there can just be interactions within the congregation where people aren't quite sure, you know, where things are coming from. Like there's a growing awareness, but we're all, like, as a society, we're not fully aware of what it means to be on the autism spectrum, or what that how wide that spectrum can be.
And it's a big spectrum.
Yeah,
that's the issue. It's such a wide spectrum, you know, like, and they don't present physically until you hear them talk or speak or see their movements. That's another issue. They don't present physically, so that's hard to get through as well.
What are the, like, what are some of the degrees that you see then, Erin? Like, like what are some, what are some of the just characteristics and things that you might experience?
Well, in my experience, I had a student from, like, in the life skills program at Marion Graham, the functional life skills program, who was verbal, but not very limited verbal, and rocked. She was your classic rocking, and fire drill set her off routine. She had to know routine. And we used the visuals, lots of visuals, because she had to know, you do this, then you do this. I had another boy that was obsessed with girls. I know that sounds funny, but in a bad way, because he'd stare at them in the hallway. So we had to come up with a solution to that. So his solution was 1, 2, 3, look away. He could look for 3. That was like 15 years ago. Sounds terrible, I know. But we had to come up with something that he could practice and know that I can look, but I have to look away. So there was that, you know, those were the lower end, I'd say, you know, they had more challenges cognitively, academically, language. So their challenges were much more than the kids I have in a regular high school. So in regular high school, these kids are academic, but it's the social part that's really impacted them. And then some of those hyposensitivity things, like the chewing the gum and tapping the pen. Don't tap a pen, because that bothers one of them too. So that's kind of the range you might have. Someone who's completely nonverbal and gets upset and will rock, and then someone who can tell you, or like has the verbal and the academic and the cognition, but might have those other little excesses and deficits at a different level.
Yeah. And do they sort of stack on top? Like, you can have kids with a multiple pieces of, like, I don't have the words to describe to ask what I'm asking.
I think it can be a variety. Like, you could have a kid with no hyposensitivities, but no language, right? So I think it can be a blend of however the neurological brain decided to impact that, right? Or what part it was impacted. But they're interesting. I love it.
Yeah. I'm talking enough. I want to make sure other people have a chance to
fun.
ask lots of questions.
They're just fun.
What? Well, okay. Before I let other people, what do you mean? How are they? What you're? I'm going to dig into you a little bit. You're passionate about this stuff. You love this stuff. Why?
I love it because I like figuring out what I need to do to help them, right? Like what behavior today, what can I do to help that behavior? Or how can I get, Hunter to look at me when I talk to him? What strategies can I give him? I like dissecting it, right? And getting into the nitty gritty and figuring out what can I do. And, when we used to do field trips with our functional life skills kids, it was a blast because you didn't know what was going to happen. We went to a swimming pool and one of my kids walked out naked from the change room because he just thought that was what he had to do. So, that wasn't appropriate, but it's, I don't know. But I think that's why I like it. Like I like to look at them and say, Piper had a bad day today, but what can I do tomorrow to make sure she's more settled and she doesn't get upset about this or that and have her be successful, right? Because someone has to advocate for them and support them. That's why I like it. And good night.
I have lots of other things I want to ask, but I'm going to let other people ask questions too. And then nobody will. Erin or Laura's going to for sure. Yeah.
So yeah, but I have a few questions actually, but I'll start with one. So what about kids that and I have like zero experience really, well, a tiny bit of experience, but kids that I think are on the spectrum, but they don't have any kind of diagnosis.
We've had students that have come through that where I've suspected that as well, but the parents won't say anything. And now I don't know if it's just they don't want to have it looked into or they just don't want people to know. And I don't know, sometimes it's a cultural thing that impacts it too. And it is a challenge, for sure. It's a challenge because something's off, but nobody wants to divulge it. They don't want to give you any information or they're not willing to talk about it. So what I've done in those situations is I've just tried to approach it with, okay, they behave this way. Can I, adapt this or try this? But if it becomes a safety thing, then you have another issue. Like if they're having outbursts, like if you think something is setting them off when you're with them and they're having outbursts, that's a way to approach it too. Like if you think the group is a safety factor, there's that approach to it, which I have used in the past. And then there's been some steps taken. But for those kids you think are kind of maybe those little things, that's a tough one. And I would just say, try to keep the routine, like do what you would do with a kid who has it and just do those things, like let them know what the routine is. Tell them, like use the visuals if you think that's going to help them. Like when you're speaking to them, use those concise instructions and see if that changes things. So all those strategies I talked about, just implement them with those individuals and those students. Because some of that stuff just as it is, but just use those things and see if it helps without having to bring attention to it, I guess, if the parents aren't willing to really discuss it. Does that make any?
Yeah, that makes sense. But so during structured time, so the one person I'm thinking of, mostly what he does is well, either he doesn't talk at all and he definitely doesn't make eye contact, but he when he does talk, he's talking mostly about things that nobody else is interested in. And so I'm not talking so when I'm having a group discussion or something, I feel pretty comfortable to say, okay, you need to let someone else talk now, or we need to get back on topic. This is what we're talking about. That feels all okay. But when we're just having social time in the group and this person is telling random facts about dinosaurs or something, kind of over and over and over, and I can tell that the other kids are getting really irritated, and I'm honestly I can only listen to it for so much myself, and I'm trying to find a way to steer that conversation away. And for most kids, neurotypical kids, I encourage them to talk and to share, and I would feel more comfortable, I guess, to a neurotypical youth to say, okay, you need to shut it. You've been talking for half an hour now, give somebody else a chance, right? But when it's somebody who's neurodiverse, like I don't know, because that's kind of how I interact. I'm kind of sarcastic and
Yeah.
and I get that they don't get that, but then I don't really know how to be or how to do that in a way that's respectful of everybody, like the neurotypical kids and the neurodiverse kid.
I'm wondering if it would work if you gave that, you said, I know this is also coming from a teacher perspective, but set a time and say, you have 2 minutes to talk about that. And then we're going to pick a different topic. And the other students are going to talk, or the other individuals are going to talk. So you're giving them that chance to say their piece, but you're giving it's limited. And you're saying, you know, you've been talking about, you want to talk about this? Okay, here, you watch this, you get 2 minutes to talk about it, and then we're going to move on. Or these guys want to talk about something different. That might be something you could try, like have topic cards or different things in that social setting where they know they get to talk, but now we have to let someone else talk. That's a strategy that they would have to learn. That's a social skill that sounds like they need to be taught from somebody, if that's the case. And I had something else and I completely got so focused on that. I forget what I was going to say now. But like how often would you be with this individual?
Well, like it's just, you know, basically once a week.
Okay.
And occasionally, you know, at other times, but generally speaking, it's like for 40 minutes once a week.
Right.
And like so we've been meeting on Zoom all year, and it actually, because I can mute him. Like I mute everybody. I don't just mute him.
Yeah.
I mute the group, and so when somebody wants to talk, I can, you know, invite them to unmute themselves and share. But there's something about, I don't know, the structure of Zoom. So there isn't in Zooming, there isn't that same kind of casual chatting, which seems to be, like you said, it's like the socialization part. And that seems to be where it gets the most complicated, because I can tell they're struggling and other youth are struggling. And I just really don't know how to bridge that or do something helpful in that situation.
Right. That is tough. And
but with Zoom, it's fine. Yeah.
Yeah. Because you could mute them, but you want to engage them differently.
So one other question, and then I'll shut up. It's so when there's a youth, okay, if you have a youth whose parent has signed on the form, like my child is on the autism spectrum, and so the other youth maybe don't know them that well, would it be like appropriate to, because I feel like the other youth would have more patience and understanding for someone that was officially neurotypical or diverse than they would for somebody that just seems to act strange and doesn't have a diagnosis or that label. So if there is somebody in the group who I know is neurodiverse, oh wait, I think I might be answering my question. So what I'm wondering if I should share that with the others, but I'm thinking maybe talking to the parent about it first and just seeing what they would suggest.
Yeah.
Because if they've written it down, that means they're on board. And
absolutely. I think the more those kids are educated and the more empathetic and compassionate they can be, it's going to help that person. And it can help them develop better social skills. If there's things the parents say, you know, this works for them, we use this to help them in this situation. And then you can share those with other individuals in the group and say, this is how we're supporting this individual. I've done it with my students. Like they all know about the kids in my class that are on the spectrum, and they are I'm fortunate they're very good with them. But when you talk about those fixations with dinosaurs, like my one student, she has a question diet. I have her on a question diet. She can only ask like a question once because she'll ask it 3 or 4 times. And that's something they have to learn. Like she has to learn that she can ask me once. And then if she starts to ask it again, she gets a signal and she knows she's already asked it, because it's just repetitive, that fixation. But absolutely, if a parent has divulged that information, I would have that open conversation and say, hey, listen, I hear there's things that we can do to support your child. What are those things I can do to support them? Do they have hyposensitivities? Do they have fixations? Do they have things do they need, like, how are they with routine and changes in routine? And have those conversations for sure.
Okay. really helpful. Thank you so much.
Erin, it kind of picks up on that a bit. Do kids who are neurodiverse know that they're neurodiverse? Like, can you have discussions about autism? Like, how do you?
It depends
how
on
do
the
you present
maturity
that?
of the student. I find, like, I had a student a couple of years ago when I was teaching in the resource program at Man Graham. He knew he was, and we talked about it. He knew what bothered him. He knew what set him off. He knew what he had to work on, and we had great conversations about it because he was at a cognitive level where he could talk about it. My grade 10 girl right now, I don't think she's there because she just doesn't understand why her peers don't respond to her and why won't anybody talk to her. So I don't think her understanding is quite there yet and comfortable, but like I said, it depends on how aware they are, the maturity, their cognition. And then the ones on the lower level wouldn't know, right? They just wouldn't understand it.
Right.
It just depends. Does that make sense?
Yeah. The spectrum is so fascinating. Like to learn. There's so many different techniques, and just hearing you say every day you have to figure out a new strategy or think about what might work tomorrow if something didn't work today, or it's fascinating to hear you talk about that.
Well, I'm wondering, for folks who are, and I know a lot of you are, folks who are in pastoral ministry or youth ministry or combination thereof, I'm curious, what are folks finding helpful strategies within your congregations or youth groups to make places more welcoming and and finding strategies for inclusion for folks who are neurodiverse? Any wisdom from the group to sort of share?
Hi, I'm Kathleen. I don't think I've actually met most of you, but I work as a Sunday school teacher at Westminster United Church here in Regina. And I have a couple kids that aren't diagnosed at this time for various reasons, but they definitely have the same issues that you've talked about. And honestly, for them, we've sort of been exploring the troubles they have together. So if they have specific triggers, we just have discussions about if something I'm doing is bothering you or something some other kid is bothering you, just give me a symbol. We can talk about it after and we'll figure out how to make this a better place for you. That way they have a little bit more autonomy in how they're handling the things that they're dealing with. And the other thing is I usually, just the same way you said, I have a routine. So we start with something that they know will usually happen. And if there's going to be something as an upset to that routine, we make a note of it. We talk about it right before we go into the room with everybody else. But yeah, that's that stuff. Just trying to make sure they have as much control as they can have so that they don't feel like out of control in the room, because that won't make it won't make anything better for them if they feel out of control.
Thanks, Kathleen. Kathleen, James Cavan, you had some information on the chat. Are you cool with sort of sharing some of that?
Sure, I'll just explain. I don't have any information.
Well, that's all right.
I just have a point of view, and it's an opinion, just based on a little bit of experience. But my experience is that within the group, the benefits are for the whole group. When you have a diverse group, the students, the young people who are not identified on the spectrum, learn a huge amount as well about themselves and about their place in the world. And I think the benefits go both ways. That's what I was trying to say. I would like to encourage us to think about the good things about diversity.
Kathleen?
It doesn't, it brings out, I noticed, like, I'm sorry, I'm talking probably way too much.
No.
In one of our home ec classes, my Asperger autism girl was in there, and another girl partnered with her, and it just was so beautiful to watch her guide her and support her. And it brought out the other students' compassion, but it really made Piper feel like she belonged, and she finally had someone that took her under her wing and was just wonderful with her. And you could just see the interaction and how it was benefiting both of them. Because one girl was using her strengths because she's so caring and compassionate, and Piper was teaching her how to, you know, this is how I do things, and also being very chatty and, you know, telling her about what her interests were, because she has some very specific interests. And it was a huge success in that classroom. And the teacher just was so excited when she saw that pairing and how it worked out. And it's something that, you know, it's a little success, but it was fantastic for both of them. Yeah.
Well, and to kind of go along with what you were saying there, Kathleen, I think like a lot of the stuff that you've talked about, you know, about making sure things are clear and concise and things like that, like, that's good for everybody. Right? Like, I'm sitting here going, yeah, you know, I could probably make my Sunday school program, you know, just better for everybody if I don't go, yeah, and then you put the thing in the thing and it turns into something pretty, you know. Actually have those clear, concise ways of being, and you know, understanding and all of that together for sure. But it seems like this would be something where you don't necessarily always have to draw attention to the one person that you're doing it for. You know, it's good for everybody.
Absolutely not, especially when you put a routine up. Everyone likes to know what the routine is. Yeah. Everyone likes visuals, especially in those Sunday school. You got pictures and they can just go, oh, we're doing this and we're doing this. Every kid likes that, right? Yeah. And like I said, nobody has to know. It just works for everyone. Yeah, for sure.
It's interesting, the things you say just sort of twig things that we're learning about adult education and like ministry stuff all the time, Erin. Like the idea of visuals in the church, we're just rediscovering the importance of visuals when in sermons and art and everything else, all those things that, you know, we created these beautiful churches based on visuals with angels and whatever floating around, and we didn't realize that was speaking to people on the various spectrums of neurodiversity in terms of different ways to express faith and teaching with visuals. So now we're learning more about it, and yeah, it's a great point that works for everybody. It's not just a certain category of how your brain operates. That's neat.
And sometimes if you know you're doing something that they maybe haven't experienced before, you can do little things to build up to that. Now, most kids, I think, have experienced a lot of things, but if you're maybe they haven't been to the forestry farm and you're doing a day trip to the forestry farm, you might have to do little things to get them comfortable with walking through the animals. Maybe they're uncomfortable with something, and you got to do those little steps to prepare them for that. Now, I don't know what extremes that would be, but I'm using an example from Temple Grandin, who is amazing, and she had an incredible mother. And when Temple had to go to university, her mother started with a small class at a college, and they kept extending it till she finally went and lived at the university. And then when she had to get her first job, she did little, you know, she started off working supervised with a woman, and then she moved into the next step. So she scaffolding, right, kept building on what the skill was. And so what you might have something where the parent might say, you know, they've never done this before. How can we scaffold so when we do the activity, it's not going to completely throw them off or, you know, surprise them, and they'll be comfortable with it. That could be something, but I just thought of that when you talk about helping the needs of everyone. And then I thought if there's a skill you need to scaffold to get there as well, or an activity of some sort.
feel free to jump in, guys. I have so many questions that I want to ask. I'll just keep asking them until other people have them. I wanted to ask you, Erin, you've been doing this for 20 some years. In that time, have you, like, it seems like there's more awareness of neurodiversity in the last however many years. Thinking of like Greta Thunberg and so many other people who are seeing neurodiversity as sort of, I think she uses the phrase superpower, and we're seeing that in so many, different understandings of these. Different understanding of neurodiversity. I mean, even the wording, we're learning new words to sort of recognize the gifts that people have. Do you have some insight into how that's sort of changed over the years and what you've seen in terms of your work?
I think part of it, honestly, the work of Temple Grandin was huge because she is an academic with a degree and she has written books. And I think when she started to write about her experiences, people realized they're smart. Like they are very, you have like, it's a spectrum, but their neurodiversity, they have these skill set that are incredible. And why are we looking at them differently when we should embrace them and see that they have these gifts that we can share? And I think diagnosis has changed over the years quite a bit, as opposed to going, oh, they're on the spectrum, we're just going to do this with them. It's become, oh, they have this neurodevelopment disorder. What can they give us, or how can we, enhance their abilities, or how can we push them and see what they can do? And I think that's why it's called the spectrum in education, because it is such a range. It's no longer just you're either autistic or Asperger's. You have a spectrum because these kids can have these gifts that they can share with the world and they can do things, or they have, when they're in a life skills functional program like that, where they still have gifts, but it's a different level. And that's what I've noticed over the years is the diagnosis has changed. The language we use has changed, and schools are inclusive. There's lots more inclusivity in the classrooms and schools. And I think that's helped. In that sense, I don't know if that answered your question, but.
It just feels like it's such a growing awareness, but a growing respect, and a desire to learn. We've come out of a time of a lot of fear, it seems like.
And you look at pop culture now too, with the start, like Big Bang Theory, The Good Doctor, Atypical, all these shows now are trying to present these people as having gifts and being something that's normal and we accept, and they are part of our world, right? I think that's come a long ways as well too, as a side note.
It had me thinking of one of our vacation Bible schools that we had. This was back when I was a teenager and my mom was the director, so I ended up doing a lot of extra stuff. But I remember one of our kids, you were talking about having a very intense interest in one thing, and he was interested in dinosaurs and birds. The two things he could tell you everything that you could possibly want to know about them. The VBS theme that year was an archaeological dig site. We were digging for God's truth. And so one of the days he got to present. And he was thrilled. The kids were thrilled because they actually wanted to hear it in that setting. They didn't necessarily care when he was talking about dinosaurs day in and day out, but in that particular setting, it worked. And so it just kind of reminds me that, there is more opening, instead of just saying, oh, well, you're just strange, go sit over there and sit and listen as best you can and we'll do everything instead. It's a sense of, well, no, he's got expertise. I don't know diddly squat about dinosaurs. He can teach, that's fine. Give it to him and let him go wild, right?
Yeah, and that's great. That's focusing what they can do, right? You're channeling it in a positive way and they're getting rewarded for it and accepted, and that's a great thing. Yeah,
it was a great thing all around.
I'll ask the question that's a challenge for a lot of us then is, what do you have any insight into what we do when we're frustrated? Like a lot of us particularly when we're working in youth ministry or ministry with children, we're on our own. We've got a group of 10 to 5, or 3 or 10 or 20 children or young people, and it's us, and we're on our own, and we're trying to manage a group without, and it's hard enough to manage hormones, let alone people with neurodiverse abilities and personalities. When we get frustrated, what do we do?
You want a good answer, or you want me to be sarcastic? No. I guess, yeah, that is a tough one. And if you have the neurodiverse person that's having an issue, if that, we'll start with that, ask yourself what triggered it, what has behavior done? Do we all just need to stop? Let's just all stop for a moment. And that's where you have to decide what helps that person in that moment. And you might just have to take a step back. Lots of times you don't know how many times a day, sometimes I just take a deep breath and a deep breath and a deep breath and say, she's acting this way because this is happening, because I can try and redirect the behavior, but I have to remember that that skill isn't completely learned yet. If you're in a large group of kids, or you've got kids like that where they're acting out, tap into your ones that you think you can connect with. This is what I do. I tap into my ones that I think are more capable and more mature. And I say, you need to do this right now because I need to deal with this. Or can you take over for this for me because I need to handle this part or whatever's going on. And I think that's where, if you get to know those students, okay, this one's really good at this, I can get them to do this. When you're having, if there's a setting where things are getting out of control, you got to take that moment and say, you can do this because that one's mature enough, and you get them to start being supportive and helpful and taking some ownership and being independent. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
Like, I'm thinking in a classroom setting, if when the things are maybe going AWOL and sideways, there's that times where I just go, okay, we're all taking a timeout right now, and we're just going to stop, because what is triggering this right now? Why is this happening? And like you said, like everybody needs that, I think, too. And you have to say, these are our expectations today. And this is where that whole thing works for everybody, right? We're doing this today. These are the expectations for the group. This is the routine for the group today. And then they're all on board, and they know what's happening, and they know what the instructions you're given. And that might help eliminate those days where you go, oh my gosh, I want to just walk out right now. But if you start out with the expectations, and you start out with what they need to do and what behaviors they need to show, and that might, when you're in that group, help eliminate some of that.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So do you have the expectations that's like a posted list of expectations? Are those sort of, how do you convey those?
I have general expectations, right? You're on time, you have all your materials, this is a safe space. So those type of things, I have the general expectations, but then each individual kid has their own. As they, like Piper's expectation, you have your question diet, remember? So I have lots of whiteboards in my room, like those little mini ones, and they all have one, and I might have to write on there that day, this is your expectation this hour, and this is what you're doing. As a general in the class, they all know that, we don't talk back, we're not rude to people, everyone feels comfortable. So those are the general expectations. But because it's a classroom setting and it's a resource room, they're all doing different things. So that's why they each have their own little list of what their expectations are for that hour. Yeah.
Yeah.
Little whiteboards are great. If you guys ever want to have and write down and go, hey, this is what's happening right now, and have them, or just to give instructions and leave them up, or have a visual or whiteboards. Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah, I think part of the struggle is that we have them for such a short period of time. So there isn't really and it is kind of chaos. Well, at the beginning, like they all come into the room at once and it's chatter, chatter, chatter. And then, you know, there's a grounding time when we light a candle and say a prayer. And then, you know, we do a check-in with each other, and then like we're close to out of time already. And then so the transition in takes a bit of time, and then you know, and then we're getting ready to go out. And so it's just not enough time. So when we do things like group sleepovers and like extra events where we have a bigger chunk of time to be together, you know, we can start to, because I mean, I'm assuming, but I think that those you know, setting guidelines and all of that takes a level of trust.
Mhm.
And it's just really hard to build that trust. Yeah. So,
And transitions are
and
hard.
especially like, I mean, yeah. And especially I think the hardest, like, because we have, I mean, they're great youth, we have amazing youth, very compassionate, but they're also youth, and they can be mean sometimes, and they're not even trying to be mean. And I mean, partly because of who I am, but we do kind of have a kind of culture of like, there's lots of sarcasm and, you know, gentle teasing and all of that kind of stuff that works, you know, so we've got 10 kids, it works for 9 kids, but not 1. And so it's like, I mean, personally, like I'm grateful that person is there, but I feel like, oh, do I have to change everything about how I do everything for 1 kid? And like, yes, the answer is yes, I do. But it's so hard because like I feel in my relationship with youth, with neurotypical youth, is easy. Like I love it. But with neurodiverse youth, I'm just at a complete loss as to what to say and how to interact, not only with the ones, like if somebody is more I don't know what the word is, but
Higher functioning?
Yeah, no, lower functioning. When somebody is lower functioning, I find it easier because it's clear. Like I feel like
yeah, there's not a gray area.
Yeah, but when it's somebody who it in many ways presents as neurotypical, except they have these little quirky social things that makes it really hard for the other youth. It's just like, I feel like I'm floundering all the time.
And you know what, you can gauge how much you could be joking and sarcastic. I think you should still do that for sure. Absolutely. And as long as, you know, unless it's giving instructions, you don't do that. But if you're just joking around about something, absolutely do it. I do it with Piper, and I know she just looks at me sometimes like I have 3 heads because she doesn't get it, but I'll still do it. Like she'll bring food from home ec and I'll go, "Where's my muffin? Why didn't you bring me some?" And she just goes, yeah. But I still say it because I'm not harming her. I'm not making fun of her, but I know she's not going to get it. But you know, you still can have that level of building a rapport, because it does build a rapport. But knowing that when you have to give those instructions and there's routine and there's expectations for this activity, that's where you want to make sure that you're being concise with them and clear with them. But aside from that, if you know, you went and watched a movie on the weekend and you said, "Guys, I saw this movie Thunder Force. It was so cheesy, but I loved it." Like, absolutely share that. And if they get it, they get it. You know, you can have that level of flexibility there, right? But I think when it comes time, like, you know, when you're coming into that room for that gathering and you get things going, you know, I'm a big thing of even for your 40 minutes, if you want to be effective in 40 minutes, give them a time. Okay, you guys get 3 minutes to talk, but then we got to move on. And then we're going to do this and we're going to do this. And that might give you more time, especially with the youth. I give a time limit on the board sometimes to say, you have 5 minutes. This is what you're doing for the next 5 minutes. And then they know the transition happens after 5 minutes. And then they know the next transition. And sometimes that helps give you a more effective time with them, like I said, and you can, you know, balance the activities.
Yeah.
But it's hard. I know they're youth.
Yeah, well, exactly. Well, and just to be clear, like most of the youth, neurotypical, neurodiverse, doesn't matter, kind of look at me like I'm a moron most of the time. So I don't know why it bothers me more when it's coming from the neurodiverse kids, but it does. It's like, I want to do it right.
Yeah, because you think, they're really smart and they're probably plotting something.
That's right.
They're figuring something out. But yeah, you should, like, I'm so used to it now, but I guess it just grows on you, and the more you're exposed to it, the easier it is. Like I said, 26 years in the business, and it's different, right? Than having suddenly a kid in your group going, oh, now what?
Mhm.
But just start out with something small. It doesn't have to be big. Like, even if it's just putting a routine on that for the 40 minutes, what you're doing for that 40 minutes. It doesn't have to be big. It can just be something small to begin with.
Are there any other sort of questions or comments that people have? Because I have one that I want to ask Erin, but sort of as a wrap up. Anything else from anyone? Erin, was there anything else that you like? You've heard a bit of this conversation. Are there other things that kind of sprung to mind that?
Absolutely. If you're struggling, reach out to me and I can try to like give you some strategies or give you some tools. Because I love this stuff. So if you're planning an activity and you have a neurodiverse individual, and you can tell me the activity and maybe I can suggest try this. Absolutely. Don't feel you have to do it on your own. Tap into your resources or tap into people who have that skill set or someone because it is daunting, and it can be. And I would absolutely love to help if you need some support with your group or anything that might, benefit you and that individual.
See, I told you she was great. I told you.
I also have a school division though that I tap into too.
Well, unless there's any other questions from other people, my big question, Erin, is, and I haven't prepped you for this at all, but
Oh boy.
can you tell us a story of a kid that you just loved? Like if you think on your career in working with the kids that you've worked with, is there a story or two where you just think, man, I love that kid and I love that story, and that's why I do what I do?
Well, it actually started at LBC because I had a student as a counselor. I had a camper who struggled, and I thought, this is what I want to do. But when I was teaching at Marion Graham, I had a girl that was Down syndrome and autistic. And I loved her to bits. She mimicked me, which I just adored to bits, because we always started with reading in the morning. So I'd sit up on my stool and have my book and we'd read. And oftentimes at break time, I'd walk in and she'd be sitting on the stool, and she had very little language, but she'd be trying to pretending she was reading. And she had a bit of a sense of humor, which was lovely because I could say stuff and make her giggle. But she called me Scrivens, and she always Scrivens. And she'd go home and she'd talk to her mom and dad, and it would just be Scrivens. And her uncle thought it was really funny, and he named their dog Scrivens. So stick with me. It's quite a funny story. My husband was working downtown and he witnessed a car getting broken into. So long story short, he called the cops, and this guy was breaking into cars and he was, stealing stuff downtown. So John's giving his statement and he's sitting in the car with the officer, and the officer goes, "Is your wife a teacher?" And John's going, "Oh crap, what did she do?" And he goes, "Yeah." And he goes, "She's a special ed teacher." And John's going, "Yeah." It was Marie's uncle Rob, whose dog was Scrivens. And he goes, "My dog's named after your wife." And, in that story, Marie was wonderful. She had the best family, supportive family. They were musical and she liked to sing, and she just kept things light and made my day. Well, they all make my day, but that's one story that she will always be one of the kids I had, especially when she named, her uncle's dog was named after me. I felt so honored. The dog was named after me. But that's probably one of my favorites. Yeah.
That's awesome, Erin. That's awesome. Ah, this is what a great evening, Erin. This was fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing all of your insights, and for everybody else too. I don't want to cut everybody else off if there's other things to add, but what a great evening. Thank you so much. I got a message that Sam and Kathleen did not leave in a huff. They weren't mad. They just had some other things to call them out. But yeah, any last comments from anyone? Well,
Just thank you. Yeah, this has been really, really helpful.
Well, thank you for entrusting me with what I can share. And I said I didn't want to make it overwhelming because it can be. And I hope that you got a few tidbits or things that can help or start with. And like I said, Kent has my email. And if you ever need anything or you have something you want to ask about, that's kind of a little bit of my business. So I'm in it. And it's good to see you too, Lindsay. I miss you. And Emmett.
Well, that's yeah. Thanks again so much, Erin. We I've been doing with these is we always close with a short blessing as well, and we kind of offer it up to the group to see if anybody wants to jump forward with a blessing. This is the this is where like people in ministry and everybody here is in ministry, just sort of look around the room like, oh, that's like I'm getting asked to do grace at a supper again. They got me. So anybody feel like I did understand the sarcasm in what she was saying, but I'm going to ignore it anyway. Please go with the joy of our faith. Go with the courage to know that you can make mistakes. Go with hope, knowing that everything that we're trying is helping us to respond to what God has asked us to be, and go with the knowledge that no matter what we do, somebody else has messed it up before we have. So Jesus is carrying us through all the mistakes and all the wonderful successes that we have. And also go with your own stories like Erin shared.